Hi everyone, let's look at some king and pawn endgames in this video. So in this position it's black to move, and black would like to find out if he can catch the white pawn before it queens on h8. It's pretty easy to count and calculate that, but there is a shortcut that comes in handy if you're short on time. It's called the square of the pawn, and the idea is you take the pawn and you draw a diagonal to the back rank, and that becomes the diagonal of a square. And the rule is if the black king can enter that square, then the white pawn will be caught. And he can do that here by moving either to d5 or d6. So for example, if he moves to d5, then the pawn will be caught. As the pawn moves forward, the square of the pawn shrinks. So here is the diagonal now, and the square is smaller, but black will continue to enter that square, and the pawn will be caught. So just a little shortcut. Okay, let's take a look at this position. So it's black to move, and he's wondering, can he draw the position by capturing the white pawns? Since the white king is far away, maybe there's a glimmer of hope. Well, he begins by attacking the front pawn on f5, but white is in time to protect it with the move g4. Now, black can attack the pawn on g4 that's supporting the f5 pawn, but white can ignore that and simply bring the king closer. The point being, the black king cannot capture the rear pawn in this pair because the front pawn will run and promote. So all black can do is move his king back and forth, and the white king will approach and help the front pawn to promote. So very easy. So two adjacent pawns support each other like that. Okay, take a look at this position which occurred in a puzzle I was playing on Lichess. So it's white to move and win. So both players are maybe trying to promote some pawns, and white's obvious try here is c takes b6, trying to promote that pawn quickly on the b8 square. And black has two possible defenses to think about. He can either try to defend with his king and run into the square of this pawn, or maybe he can seek counterplay by pushing his own passed pawn here. Well, the counterplay plan doesn't work because white will promote first and stop black from promoting. So we're back to the idea of bringing the king into play. So after c takes b6, black is forced to try king to d6 to stop the pawn. But then white has an easy win with king takes e4. So here, to explain why white is winning, we're going to put together the last two concepts we just talked about. One concept is the square of this black pawn is right here, and white is already sitting inside of that square, so the black pawn cannot promote. And the second concept at play in this endgame is that this pawn on a4 can come to a5 and support the b6 pawn, and these pawns mutually defend each other. So, for example, black can run towards that pawn, but white can support it. Black can try to promote his pawn, but white gets back into the square. And there's nothing black can do. He will lose this pawn, and black can never capture on a5 without the b pawn promoting. So easy win for white. Okay, let's take a look at this endgame. White to play and win. So when there's a pair of locked pawns like this, then the aggressor is trying to achieve a key square. The key squares that white is heading for with his king are right here, here, and here. There are three key squares next to the enemy pawn. Actually, there are six because there are three on the other side, one being off the board, but the key squares on the right aren't important because the kings are on the left side of the pawns right now. So if white can get his king to one of these three key squares, then he will be able to outmaneuver the black king and win this pawn, and then promote his own. Let's see how it happens. There's only one winning move for white. He must play king to d5 and gain the opposition. and this forces the black king to give ground. He can't move to c7 because his pawn will immediately be captured, so he can try to move to e7, but that gives up control of this key square on c6. So white has achieved one of the key squares, and so now it is easy for white to outflank the black king, push it to the right, and then win this pawn. Let's see how that happens. Maybe king to e8 here, king to d6, heading for that pawn. And white doesn't even really have to try very hard or think about this. It's just very natural. King to f7, king to d7, king to f8, king to e6, attacking the pawn, forcing black to defend it. But then king to e7 keeps attacking the pawn, and the black king cannot keep defending it. He has to move aside, and the pawn gets captured. Now you might know that when you have a pawn and king against a lone king, then in order to win, you need to get the king ahead of the pawn. When the pawn is on the 5th rank like this, then it suffices for your king to be just 1 rank ahead of the pawn. These are the 3 key squares for that pawn, and if the white king can land on one of them, then he will be able to promote. And the white king is already on one of them, so this is a win. Let's see how it might finish. King to f8, king to e6. Black might try to retain the opposition here, but white has a tempo move, f6. Black should step in front of the pawn, but white can push the pawn right up against the king like that, and now there's only one legal move. The king gets squeezed out to the g7 square, and the white king comes forward, and promotion happens on the next move. Okay, let's look at another endgame. So suppose you have a 2-to-1 pawn majority like in this position. It is winning for white, but you have to take a little care. There are a lot of winning methods. I think the most direct move here to make is the move g5. You get this locked pair of pawns, and you have an extra pawn on f4 that may be needed. If you ignore the pawn on f4 and just look at the locked pair, then from what we learned in the last position, white would try to achieve one of these 3 key squares next to the enemy pawn. And if he can get his king to one of those squares, then he can outflank the black king and win black's pawn and easily queen. Well, black can try to defend those key squares. Let's see what will happen. So maybe black goes to e6, white can bring the king to e4, and now black has a choice. If he steps backward, white will come forward. For example, if he steps back to e7, then white will go to e5, the only winning move, gaining the opposition, forcing the black king to give ground. And as soon as he gives ground, white can achieve one of those key squares. And even if he didn't have the pawn on f4, this would be winning for white, as we saw in the last endgame. Okay, so what happens if instead of stepping back to e7, black steps back to f7? Well, then king to d5 heads for that key square right there, and black would have to protect it, and the only way to do it is king to e7, but again, white attains the opposition and forces black aside and gets the key square. So falling back is not really an option. Falling back to d7 allows white to gain the opposition here on d5. Black can move to e7. King goes to e5 with opposition, and we have the same position we've already seen before. So falling back with the black king is not really an option. So the only other thing to consider is what if he moves his king to d6? Well, this is a little tricky. The winning plan here is to push the f-pawn to f5. And the idea is black can't capture it. If he tries, then white will capture, and black cannot stop white. White already has one of the 3 key squares for the pawn, and it's very easy to promote. So what can black do if he doesn't capture? Well, he can try to run back with his king and defend the position, but white has a winning move here. and only one winning move. So this endgame does require some study. The winning move is f6 check. Okay? Let's say the king moves here and tries to defend the position. Then white has a lot of winning moves here, but he should head up the board, king to d5 for example, king to f8, maybe king here, maybe that king gets the opposition, but f7 check is fine, king to f8, king to d5, allow that pawn to be taken. And why did I do such a silly thing? Well, I wanted to show you that now white gains one of the 3 key squares for this locked pawn configuration. So the rest is really easy. All right, so no matter what black does, let's say it goes here, white heads for the pawn and tries to win it, and black can protect it, but not forever. And you win the pawn, and you're already on one of the key squares, so it's easy to win. Let's finish it out, though. It is sometimes a little tricky with a knight pawn. So let's say king to g8 happens, then king to h6, and let's say king over here to gain the opposition. Then we push our pawn up, forcing the king over here, and then g7 forces the king out like that. And that's an easy win. Okay, let's look at one last position. All right, I had this position in a game. I was the white player, and I was playing against Stockfish level 6. Level 6 is a 2300 engine. So it doesn't play perfectly. It doesn't have access to the endgame table bases, and it has a limited amount of depth in its searching. So it was black to move here, and analyzing after the game, I discovered that black has one move that draws this position, and every other move loses. Well, my opponent played king to e4, which was a losing move. It looks like a fancy move. Instead of just capturing the pawn, black is saying, hey, wait a minute. I'm gaining the opposition here, and I can capture that pawn next. So isn't it better to capture the pawn and retain opposition? Superficially, that seems like a possibility, but it turns out not to work because white has the nice move f5, which wins, the only winning move, f5. And the point of this is this pushes the black king back, and white makes forward progress with his king. Black can play either king e5 here or king takes f5. There's not much difference, and white comes forward with his king. Here, the only winning move is king to d3. Now let's talk about why. What's going on in this position? Oops, I didn't mean to make that move. So what's going on in this position? Well, white would like to win this pawn on g4. Now, these pawns are not locked, but imagine they were. Imagine the pawn on h2 were sitting on g3. Then with that pair of locked pawns, white is trying to gain one of these 3 key squares. And if his king can land on one of those key squares, then he can outflank the black king and win his pawn. Now, he wouldn't be able to necessarily promote his h-pawn, but he can use it as a distraction. And while black is stopping it, the white king can run over and capture the b6 pawn and then promote on the b file. Okay, so how does white get to one of these key squares? Well, he has to run for this one, the remote key square over here on d4. So the only winning move is king to d3. Black has to protect that key square with king to e5. By the way, at no point does black benefit from pushing this pawn because white will simply capture it and use this pawn as a decoy. And while black is going after it, like I said before, the white king will run over and take on b6. Okay, so he has to protect that key square with king to e5, but then white gains the opposition and forces the black king aside, and then white wins by getting a key square. Okay, and let's say that, just to see how it finishes, let's say the king moves to g5. Well, the white king just approaches the pawn. Let's say it goes to h4. It approaches it again. Now there's a difference here. The pawns are not locked like they were in the previous endgame we looked at. The black king can run down and try to capture the pawn on h2. But the point of white's play is as soon as he does, white will be ready to capture the g4 pawn. And then white will be able to run back and capture on b6. So let's say black doesn't run down and he moves here to h5, then white would move to f5, and if black wants to protect his pawn, he has to move to h4. Then white moves all the way up here to g6, cutting off the black king and forcing it down the board. Again, pushing this pawn doesn't really help. White will run over and win the b6 pawn. So the black king is forced down to h3, and the white king needs to come up and attack that g pawn. And so the king now is forced to abandon it. He can't move here, so he might as well grab the white pawn. White grabs that pawn, and then you can see it's very easy here to run back and win the black pawn and the game. So those are some of the ideas of how white wins after black's mistaken first move. Okay, black needed to capture that pawn. As we saw, king to f4 allows this pawn to come forward, and then white is able to run for that key square. So how should black have held the position? Well, he should take the pawn, and now white has to be careful that the black king doesn't sneak forward and win this pawn. For example, a losing move here would be running the king to the d file, trying to gain one of the key squares, because the black king doesn't have to stay back. He can come forward. And black is going to win that pawn in 2 moves, and then 3 more to promote makes 5 moves. And the only thing white can do in the meantime is do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves, and he still needs 3 more moves to promote his pawn. So black is winning that race. So white needs to protect his pawn by moving his king to, let's say, f2. Now, black is further up the board now than he was when we saw in the other line white pushed his pawn to f5 and drew the king back. So now, from this position, black can easily protect these key squares. Let's say he moves to f5. Well, white can try to run for the key squares like king to e3, but black gains the opposition himself with king to e5, and he will be able to hold those key squares, and there's nothing white can do. However, that's not the way the engine played, and I was able to win the endgame due to his lack of king and pawn knowledge. All right, I hope you learned something from this video. I did. Thanks for watching.